Welcome, everyone. Before we start, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Drop a comment below. Also, tell me what kind of stories you'd love to hear. Stay tuned till the end. Story 1. I never used to believe in the idea that someone could be watching without you knowing. That changed when I heard this story. It started with small things. My mother's friend lived alone in a small house, quiet and routine. But little details began to bother her. A carton of eggs missing, a pot of soup running out quicker than she remembered, damp towels in the hamper, though she had not showered that day, dishes in the sink she did not use. At first, she told herself she was just being forgetful. Maybe she had left the stove on a little longer. Maybe she had been using more ingredients than she realized. But deep down, something felt wrong. Then the nights became uneasy. Soft noises from the attic, a shuffle, a creak, barely noticeable, just enough to make her stop for a second. But one night, the sound was different, heavier, a slow, deliberate thud above her bedroom ceiling. She grabbed a flashlight and climbed the attic ladder. The air was thick and musty. She swung the beam of light across the space, and her breath caught in her throat. A makeshift living area, a sleeping bag, an old radio, a hot plate, and scattered food wrappers. A pillow with an indentation. Someone had been living there. She rushed downstairs, locked herself in her room, and called the police. Officers arrived quickly and searched the house. They found no one inside, but they decided to keep an eye on the place, just in case. A few nights later, they caught him, a man climbing a tree, trying to slip through the attic window. He had been doing this for months. Every morning, he waited for her to leave for work, then came down, ate her food, used her shower, and blended into her life without her ever knowing. He had been there all along, moving silently just above her. But the story did not end the way most would expect. She spoke to him. He was not dangerous, not violent, just lost, desperate. Against all logic, she chose to help him instead of pressing charges. She let him stay, this time with permission. She helped him find a job, and for months he lived in the attic, no longer hiding until he was able to move on. She tells the story with a strange fondness, like it was just another chapter in her life. But sometimes she still wonders, how long had he been there before she noticed? How many nights had she slept beneath his quiet footsteps? And when she lays in bed, listening to the stillness of her home, she cannot help but ask herself, is she truly alone? Story 2. I used to think that if you survived an accident, you were safe. That is not always true. My friend's boss was thrilled when he bought his brand new Audi A4 convertible. Back then, it was one of the most talked about cars. One of its selling points was the hidden pop-up roll bars designed to deploy in case of a rollover. He never imagined he would ever need them. Months later, he lost control of the car. On a sharp turn, the tires screeched, and in seconds, he was sliding down a steep embankment, nearly 35 feet deep. Bushes and branches clawed at the car as it tumbled. Then everything stopped. The roll bars had done their job. The car landed upright. He was alive. Shaken but unharmed, except for a few scratches, he unbuckled himself and climbed out. His legs were steady. He could walk. It felt like a miracle. He scrambled up the bank, every step feeling surreal. The road was right there, as if nothing had happened. He pulled out his phone to call the police, his hands trembling only slightly. A few minutes later, a driver who had witnessed the crash pulled over. He got out, approaching carefully from behind. "Hey, are you okay?" the driver asked. The man turned his head to respond, and then he dropped. No scream, no sound, just a lifeless fall onto the pavement. The driver rushed to him, but it was too late. His body was completely still. At first, it made no sense. He had been walking, talking, functioning just fine. How could he be dead? The police arrived soon after, but there was nothing anyone could do. The man was gone. Later, doctors confirmed what had happened. His neck had been fractured during the crash, but it had stayed intact, just barely. The only thing keeping him alive was the delicate balance of the injury. The moment he turned his head, the fracture severed his spinal cord completely. He died instantly. It was a cruel irony. He had survived the crash, pulled himself from the wreckage, and made it all the way back to safety. He had stood by the road, convinced he had just escaped death. But death had been waiting for him all along, inside him, just beneath the surface. One movement. That was all it took. People still talk about the accident. Some call it a freak event. Others say it is proof that sometimes fate has already decided. No matter how much you fight, no matter how much you survive, when your time comes, it comes. And sometimes you never see it coming. Story 3. There are some crimes so disturbing they become legends of horror, stories whispered in the dark, cases that no one dares to forget. These are not just tales. These are real horrors buried beneath the surface of everyday life. A young woman was walking home one evening when a van pulled up beside her. It was still early, the sun barely setting, and she was only a few blocks from home. The man inside asked for directions. She hesitated. "It was just a question," she told herself. Nothing to be afraid of. But the moment she stepped closer, the door slid open, a hand shot out, and she was gone. Days passed, then weeks. Posters with her face were everywhere, but no one saw her again. When her body was finally found, it was in a rundown, abandoned building on the edge of town. The things that had been done to her, no one wanted to speak of them. The walls of that place had been covered in words, messages, scrawled in what looked like dried markings. Some were apologies, some were warnings, but one stood out. She was not the first. She will not be the last. Another case. A detective followed the trail of a missing child, one who had vanished without a trace from a playground. His search led him to an old house, one that should have been abandoned. He forced his way in. The air was thick with the smell of decay. The walls were covered in photographs, children staring blankly at the camera. Some had been missing for years. In the center of the room was a chair, its arms wrapped in rusted restraints. He reached for his phone. Then he noticed something. A new picture sitting on the chair. It was of him, taken from behind in that very room. A woman moved into a new apartment trying to start fresh. She found it strange that the place had been so cheap, but she did not ask questions. At first, everything seemed normal, but soon she started noticing little things. Her belongings were moved. Lights she had turned off were suddenly on. And then there were the whispers, soft, almost too faint to hear, but they were there. One night, she set up her phone to record while she slept. The next morning, she played the audio. The whispers were clearer now. A voice, low, raspy. It only said one thing. Why did you move in? Some stories have no answers. Some horrors are never solved. And sometimes the scariest part is knowing that whoever was behind them is still out there, watching, waiting. Story 4. Some stories defy logic. Some things happen that should not be possible, and yet they do. My father told me something before he passed, something he had kept to himself for years. It happened during his time in Vietnam in the 1960s, deep in the jungle where death could come from anywhere at any moment. He was part of a small unit. Just him, another American soldier, and 5 South Vietnamese fighters. Their mission was simple: plant seismic sensors along a hidden trail to track enemy movement. For 2 days, they moved quietly, staying low, avoiding detection. Then, my father and 2 others split from the main group to watch a key intersection in the jungle, a place where paths crossed. The jungle was alive with noise, the constant hum of insects, the occasional cry of a distant monkey. Hours passed as they lay hidden, watching, waiting. Nothing. It was quiet. too quiet. They debated whether to move deeper into the jungle or return to their team. My father took one last look at the trail ahead before stepping out, and then he saw him. A soldier was lying along the trail just ahead, but not an enemy soldier, not a man who should have been there. His uniform was different, dark blue, worn but intact. His skin was light brown. He wore 2 pistols on his belt, a rifle slung across his chest, and a short, curved club at his hip. The soldier turned his head and looked right at my father. Then he smiled. Slowly, he lifted a finger to his lips. Silent. Do not move. Do not speak. Then, with one slow movement, he motioned for my father to step back into the brush. My father obeyed, signaling his men to stay low. Less than 10 seconds later, the jungle erupted with movement. A column of enemy soldiers, North Vietnamese fighters, at least 70 strong, marched right through the trail intersection. They carried rifles, grenades, heavy weapons. If my father had stepped out a second earlier, they all would have died. He did not hesitate. As soon as the enemy was gone, they ran. They did not stop until they reached the rest of their patrol. He told them about the enemy soldiers, reported what he had seen, but he never mentioned the man in blue. Not then, not for years. It was not until his final days that he finally told me the truth. And he had told one other person before that, his grandmother, as she lay on her deathbed in the 1970s. When he told her what he had seen, she only smiled. She did not even open her eyes. You saw Red Tom, she whispered. Red Tom, my great-great-grandfather, a scout for the Union Army during the Civil War, a man who carried 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle, and a Creek war club, a man who had been dead for 100 years. Story 5. Some nightmares do not end when you wake up. Some leave scars that never fade. She was just a college freshman, excited for a night out with friends. The party was at another university, about 25 miles away. She arrived with a friend, laughing, enjoying the music, the games, the crowded energy of the night. But at some point, she drifted away from her group, stepping outside for air. That was the last time anyone saw her. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Calls were made. Panic set in. The police were contacted, but she was simply gone. No clues, no sign of where she had gone or who had taken her. For 10 days, her name was a whisper in every conversation. Posters covered the city. Everyone feared the worst. Then, out of nowhere, she appeared. A homeless man saw her crawling toward a bus stop, barely alive, whispering for help. One arm and one leg were broken. Her skin was bruised, covered in cuts. She had survived something horrific, something beyond anyone's imagination. She had been drugged that night, her drink laced without her knowing. A group of men led her away, taking her to an apartment. She was kept in a locked room, given nothing but a bucket to use as a bathroom. They injected her with drugs, breaking her mind and body. The nightmare stretched on for days, but she never gave up. In a moment of desperation, she convinced one of them to let her use the bathroom to clean up. He agreed. That mistake cost them everything. The bathroom had a small window. With the shower running to muffle the noise, she squeezed through and fell 3 stories, crashing into a thick hedge below. She did not stop. She crawled through the complex, dragging her broken limbs, inching her way toward the road. By the time she reached the bus stop, she was barely conscious, but she was free. The homeless man called the police. Cars stopped. Strangers rushed to help her. Her captors never got the chance to take her back. 3 men were arrested days later. Security footage traced them back to the apartment where she had been held. She had spent 10 days in hell, but she survived. She returned to college 2 years later, graduated, and became a nurse. She never partied again. She carried a gun wherever she could. She moved forward, but she never forgot. And neither did we. Story 6. Some warnings are impossible to ignore. Some instincts save lives. When my aunt was 16, she worked at a grocery store. Her manager was in his mid-20s, a man she barely knew outside of work. One evening, he called her house. His voice was urgent, insistent. He wanted her to sneak out and meet him. Said it would be fun. Said no one had to know. She hesitated. He was her boss. Saying no felt wrong, like it might cost her job. Maybe he was just being friendly. Maybe she was overthinking it. But my mother, 2 years younger than her, had a bad feeling. She always had strong instincts about things, and that night, something in her gut told her this was not safe. She begged my aunt not to go, told her it felt wrong, that something bad was going to happen. Reluctantly, my aunt listened. She called him back and told him no. His voice changed. The friendliness was gone. He was furious. He hung up without another word. That night, he found someone else, a girl about my aunt's age. He convinced her to go with him to a secluded spot near the cliffs outside of town. Whatever he said to her, whatever lies he told, she believed him until it was too late. He attacked her. He did things too terrible to repeat, and when he was done, he dragged her to the edge and pushed her over. She should have died, but somehow she survived. Broken, bleeding, barely clinging to life. She was found at the bottom of the cliffs, and she told the police everything. He was arrested soon after, sent away for years. But that night, it could have been my aunt. It should have been. If she had ignored my mother's warning, if she had listened to her doubt instead of her fear, she would not be here today. Some people call it intuition. Others call it luck. But whatever it was, it saved her life that night. And the older I get, the more I believe in it too. Always trust your gut. Story 7. Some nightmares are not about ghosts or monsters. Sometimes the real horror is being trapped, alone, with no way out. In my hometown, deep in the woods, there are massive houses with tall, iron gates. One night, a man who lived in one of those homes went out drinking with friends. By the time he stumbled back home, he realized something. He had forgotten his gate key. Drunk and frustrated, he decided to climb over it. It seemed simple enough. He had done it before, but this time, in his clumsy, intoxicated state, he slipped. One of the iron spikes at the top of the gate drove straight through his leg. Pain shot through him. He gasped, but no one heard. His body dangled from the gate, his weight pulling against the wound, his blood dripping onto the cold pavement below. He wanted to scream, to call his wife inside the house, but he stopped himself. The gate was automatic. If she opened it, the heavy metal would slide to the side, and if that happened, it would tear his leg clean off. So he stayed silent. All night he hung there, alone, bleeding, his mind racing between fear and agony. The stars above him blurred as exhaustion set in. His fingers went. His breaths became shallow. But he did not let go. He could not. When the sun rose, his wife finally woke up. She stepped outside and screamed. There he was, limp and barely conscious, impaled on the very gate that was meant to keep danger out. She called for help. My father, a firefighter, was one of the first responders on the scene. He told me what they had to do. There was no easy way to get him down. They had to saw through the metal spike itself, carefully working around the wound, trying not to make it worse. The man survived, barely. But my father said something that stuck with me. Imagine hanging there all night, bleeding, silent, knowing that help was just inside, but calling for it could cost you your leg. Some fears are not about what lurks in the dark. Some horrors come from the choices you are forced to make. Story 8. When I was 18, I worked at a U-Haul rental shop. It was right in front of a club known for trouble, fights, drugs, the kind of place people warned you to stay away from. People talked about bad things happening there, but I never thought I would witness one firsthand. One morning, I arrived early to open. The air was cool, the parking lot empty. Everything was quiet, just the usual stillness before the day began. Then there was a knock at the door. Not a normal knock. Frantic, desperate, the kind that makes your stomach drop. I froze. I was alone. My heart pounded as I walked toward the door, my hands already clammy. Something inside me screamed that something was wrong. Outside stood a woman, completely naked, covered in something dark. Her face was twisted in terror, her body shaking violently. She pounded on the glass, eyes wide, pleading. For a second, I could not move. My brain could not process what I was seeing. Then instinct kicked in. I grabbed my phone and called the police. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock and stepped outside. The smell hit me first. Foul, overwhelming, sweat, bodily fluids, something worse. I grabbed a moving blanket from the truck bay and wrapped it around her trembling frame. Up close, I saw the truth. The dark stains covering her body were bodily fluids, and something worse. She collapsed into me, sobbing. Her breath was ragged, her words broken. She could barely stand. I held her up, my mind racing, my stomach turning. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights painting the lot in red and blue. Officers rushed over, asking her questions, but she barely spoke. Her words were slurred, disconnected. Later, I found out why. She had been at the club the night before. Someone drugged her, took her, did things to her no one should ever endure. Then they left her in an alley, unconscious, tossed away like trash. She woke up alone, confused, barely able to stand. And somehow, she made it to my door. The officers took her away, but that was not the end of it. The club shut down months later. Rumors spread about what had been happening there for years, about others who were not as lucky as her, about how close I had come to being just another bystander in a city full of secrets. That image never left me. Her face, the way her fingers clawed at the glass, the way she smelled of bodily fluids and fear, the way the world kept spinning, even as hers fell apart. I never looked at that club the same way again, and I never opened alone after that. Story 9. I was staying in a rundown motel, the kind of place people warned you about. The neon sign outside flickered, barely holding on. The walls were paper thin, letting in every sound from the rooms next door. Laughter, shouting, things best left unheard. The bed was crawling with bed bugs. I was too exhausted to complain. I just needed to make it through the night. Instead of risking the filthy bed, I curled up in the bathtub, It was cold and hard, but at least I would not wake up covered in bites. I shut my eyes, trying to ignore the distant hum of the freeway outside. Sleep was light and uneasy. A noise jolted me awake, a sharp crack. I held my breath, listening. Then came another, glass shattering. My stomach dropped. Someone was breaking in. My pulse pounded in my ears as I grabbed my knife from my bag. Slowly, I pushed open the bathroom door. My hands shook as I gripped the handle, stepping out into the dark room. And then I saw him. A man was halfway through my window, one leg already inside. His body was tense, frozen in place. We locked eyes for several seconds. Neither of us moved. The only sound was the faint rustling of the curtains blowing in the night breeze. His face twisted in shock, as if he had not expected anyone to be there. Then he spoke. "Is this your room?" His voice was casual, almost annoyed, like I had interrupted him. My grip on the knife tightened. My mouth was dry. "Yes, this is my room." Another long pause. The air between us was thick with something unspoken, something dangerous. Then, slowly, he started backing out of the window. His eyes never left mine. He muttered under his breath, cursing me, as if I was the one at fault, as if I had made things inconvenient for him, and then he was gone. I stood there for a long time, barely breathing. My whole body was shaking. I listened for footsteps, for anything. But the night was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But it had. I imagined how differently this could have gone. What if I had been asleep in that bed? What if I had not woken up in time? What if I had not had the knife? The what-ifs spiraled through my mind until the sun came up. As soon as daylight broke, I grabbed my things and left. I did not tell the front desk. I did not look back. I just drove, putting as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I never went back, and I never slept in an unlocked room again. Story 10. Years ago, before cell phones were common, we relied on pagers, a small device strapped to your hip, beeping whenever someone needed you. As an on-call technician in the audio-visual industry, my pager went off all the time, but 911 pages were rare. A 911 meant it was urgent. It meant drop everything and call back. That afternoon, I was driving from Orlando to St. Petersburg on Interstate 4 when my pager beeped. A number I did not recognize. 911. My gut clenched. I took the first exit, pulling into a small, run-down truck stop outside of Plant City. I hurried inside, asked the cashier for change, and made my way to a row of payphones against the wall. I picked one at random, fed in a quarter, and dialed the number. It rang, and rang, and rang. I frowned. Who would page me with a 911 and not answer? My frustration was growing when I heard it, another ringing sound, separate from the one in my ear. I pulled the receiver away. 2 payphones over, another phone was ringing. An incoming call. A chill crept up my spine. I hung up and hesitated before stepping toward the other phone. Slowly, I picked up the receiver and glanced at the number printed above the buttons. It was the same as the one on my pager. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring. My breath felt thin. My hands shook. I checked again. It was a perfect match. Except for the 911, the numbers were identical. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I turned to the cashier, my voice uneasy. Did you see anyone use these phones before I got here? She shook her head. You're the only one who's been in here for the past hour. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My instincts screamed at me to leave, so I did. I hurried back to my car, started the engine, and pulled back onto the highway. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. About 10 miles down the road, I saw it. A disaster. A massive crash. 4 cars, a tractor trailer, overturned. Its steel load spilled across the asphalt. State troopers and paramedics had just arrived. The wreckage looked catastrophic. I pulled over and did what I could to help, but it was already too late for some of them. The realization hit me hard. If I had not stopped at that truck stop, if I had not answered that impossible page, I would have been right in the middle of it. I never figured out who or what sent that message. I never saw that number again, but I am convinced without a doubt that it saved my life. Some things cannot be explained, and maybe they are not meant to be.